In August 2006, in the Toronto suburb of Scarborough, one of the most powerful empires in North American audio began to quietly lose its voice. Klipsch Group, an American audio giant, acquired Audio Products International, the massive Canadian parent company behind Energy Speakers. That signature meant the eventual silencing of a domestic speaker building machine that had once commanded the market. The sheer scale of what was about to be lost is difficult to overstate. This was not a boutique garage workshop. The API facility in Scarborough was a sprawling 165,000 square foot factory. It was a place that had shipped hundreds of thousands of meticulously engineered speaker cabinets to trusted hi-fi dealers and future shop audio walls across the globe. But following the acquisition, the footprint inevitably shrank. The domestic assembly lines eventually slowed. The Canadian engineering infrastructure that had defined the energy sound was fundamentally changed. The consequences rippled outward. Factory workers in Ontario lost a shop floor that had anchored their community. Local hi-fi dealers lost a premium, lab-tested product they could confidently demonstrate in their listening rooms. Listeners who had trusted the Energy badge for decades suddenly found that a name once synonymous with precise, measurement-driven design was becoming just another asset in a global corporate portfolio. A brand that had proudly anchored countless Canadian basement rec rooms was slowly transforming into an online curiosity or a discounted box on a big box retail shelf. A decade earlier, the Energy name had meant the exact opposite. It had represented an unyielding scientific standard, backed by rigorous acoustic research. The paradox is that Energy did not disappear because Canada stopped listening. It disappeared because the way the world bought speakers had changed. But the real story of Energy Speakers is not only the story of a corporate buyout. It is the story of what happens when a Canadian measurement culture is forced to compete with global manufacturing and retail convenience. Every week, we tell the stories of the Canadian speakers, factories, hi-fi dealers, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music and film, and what happened when the global market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place, inside an Ottawa acoustic lab in 1982. In 1982, the Canadian hi-fi market, short for high fidelity, meaning sound reproduction that tries to stay faithful to the original recording, was a noisy, highly subjective landscape. Walk into a wood-paneled audio showroom in Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver at the dawn of the decade, and a buyer was immediately surrounded by competing mythologies. Salesmen sold speakers based on exotic cabinet materials, aggressive brand marketing, or simply whichever model played the loudest on the heavily carpeted showroom floor. A speaker, a device that turns an electrical audio signal into sound moving through air, was often designed entirely by ear, tuned to the personal and subjective taste of a single lead engineer at a manufacturing plant. The problem was that a speaker tuned to sound impressive in a carefully treated retail store often sounded harsh, boomy, and fatiguing when placed in a typical Canadian living room or a basement rec room. There was no scientific baseline. The market desperately lacked a proven, objective standard for what actually constituted good, accurate sound. A few hours east of the Toronto manufacturing hubs in Ottawa, that missing standard was quietly being built by the federal government. At the National Research Council, widely known as the NRC, a researcher named Dr. Floyd Toole was conducting exhaustive, groundbreaking experiments on human hearing and loudspeaker design. The NRC possessed a world-class anechoic chamber, a specialized test room designed to absorb all acoustic reflections so a speaker can be measured exactly, without the walls, floor, or ceiling interfering. Toole's research sought to answer a fundamental, industry-altering question. If you remove brand loyalty, marketing hype, and visual bias from the equation, what kind of sound do human beings actually prefer? To find out, The NRC set up rigorous blind listening tests. They placed listeners in a specific chair behind a visually opaque, acoustically transparent curtain in a dedicated listening room designed to mimic a standard domestic Canadian living space. Using a specialized mechanical shuffler, researchers moved different speakers into the exact same physical position behind the drape. Listeners ranked the sound without ever knowing which brand or which price tag they were hearing. The results dismantled the audio industry's reliance on magic. The data definitively proved that regardless of age, gender, or musical taste, listeners consistently preferred speakers with a flat frequency response, meaning the speaker reproduced low, middle, and high sounds evenly, without artificially boosting the bass to sound powerful or peaking the treble to sound detailed. Just as importantly, the NRC tests revealed that off-axis response was critical. A speaker did not just send sound directly into a listener's face, it splashed acoustic energy off the side walls, the floor, and the ceiling. If those reflected sounds were chaotic or uneven, the human brain instantly recognized the sound as artificial. If the off-axis sound matched the direct sound smoothly, the listener perceived a highly realistic soundstage. The perceived width, depth, and placement of music created by a stereo system. Audio Products International, known across the industry as API, had already been operating in the Greater Toronto Area as a massive umbrella corporation manufacturing various budget and mid-tier speaker lines. They knew how to move volume. They knew how to cut wood and ship boxes. But the executives and engineers at API recognized that the new NRC research represented a tectonic shift in audio engineering. It was a roadmap to building a prestige speaker that could not be argued with. If a company could build a cabinet, the wooden, plastic, or composite box that holds the drivers and shapes how the speaker interacts with the air, that perfectly match the NRC's acoustic targets, they would not need to rely on a stereo salesman's pitch. The measurements would prove the quality before the music even started playing. API decided to direct its formidable engineering resources toward creating a flagship brand that would embody this new Canadian measurement culture. They called the project Energy. The engineering brief for their first major model, the Energy 22, was brutal. To achieve the wide, even dispersion required by the NRC data, the new speaker could not use standard, off-the-shelf components. Common drivers of the era were highly directional. They fired high frequencies in a narrow, laser-like beam, which completely ruined the stereo image for anyone not sitting perfectly in the center of the sofa. The API design team realized that to win the blind lab tests, they had to completely rethink the tweeter, a small driver designed to reproduce high frequencies such as cymbals, strings, and vocal detail. The standard paper, phenolic, or cheap plastic domes available from global suppliers distorted too easily when pushed to handle lower frequencies, and they failed to spread sound widely enough across a physical room. Furthermore, the crossover, an electrical network inside a speaker that sends bass, mid-range, and treble to the drivers designed to handle them, had to seamlessly blend the tweeter with a woofer, a large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies such as bass and drums. The API engineers began sketching a radically different high-frequency driver on their laboratory tables. It needed to be large enough to handle an immense amount of amplifier power without burning out its voice coil, a coil of wire attached to the speaker cone that moves when electricity passes through it. Yet it had to be light enough to stop and start instantly. It required a massive magnet structure, far heavier and more expensive than what competitors were using, and a dome shape that could push acoustic energy outward in a perfect, wide hemisphere. This was the conceptual birth of what would become the famous Dual Hyperdome tweeter. In the R&D rooms in Ontario, it was not just a part. It was an ambitious mechanical engine designed specifically to conquer the NRC's testing protocols. The drawings promised a speaker that would measure flatter, play louder, and image better than anything else in its class, bringing the absolute truth of the broadcast studio into the Canadian home. The lab work proved that API had the talent to design a masterpiece. But the product that proved the lab was right also taught the company how expensive proof could become. In 1982, the theoretical blueprints drawn up under the influence of the Ottawa Acoustic Labs finally became a physical reality on the API assembly line in Ontario. The result was the Energy 22. To look at it, the speaker appeared relatively conventional. A handsome, heavy rectangular cabinet finished in real wood veneer, designed to sit on a dedicated metal stand in a Canadian living room. But removing the black fabric grille revealed that the engineering team had not compromised on their ambitious laboratory targets. The most striking visual and mechanical feature sat at the top of the baffle. It was the realization of their radical high-frequency driver concept, the famous Dual Hyperdome tweeter. A tweeter, a small driver designed to reproduce high frequencies such as cymbals, strings, and vocal detail, is typically the most fragile and easily distorted part of a speaker. In the early 1980s, mass-market tweeters were often simple plastic, paper, or cheap phenolic domes that struggled to push high-frequency sound evenly into a room without breaking up at high volumes. The API engineers completely abandoned this cheap, off-the-shelf approach. The Dual Hyperdome was a staggeringly complex mechanical device. It utilized a massive, heavy magnet structure that allowed the tweeter to handle immense amounts of amplifier power without instantly melting its voice coil. But the dome itself was the true engineering breakthrough. It was constructed from a specialized polymer and, crucially, it required an intense level of manual labor to manufacture. Each Dual Hyperdome tweeter involved a precise, hand-assembled process on the Canadian factory floor, incorporating an intricate stitching and gluing phase to attach the suspension to the dome. This was not a generic part that could be stamped out by a machine in seconds. It was a precision instrument built by Canadian hands, designed to force acoustic energy outward in an almost perfect, uniform hemisphere. The physical result of this painstaking labor was an astonishing change in how music actually behaved inside a room. Because the Dual Hyperdome tweeter dispersed high frequencies so widely and evenly, it effectively eliminated the narrow sweet spot problem that plagued older designs. A listener did not have to sit rigidly in the dead center of a sofa to hear a realistic stereo image. The illusion that sounds come from places between and around two speakers. Instead, the Energy 22 projected a massive, stable soundstage, the perceived width, depth, and placement of music created by a stereo system. Whether the listener was sitting in a designated chair or walking across their basement rec room, the musicians seemed to exist as physical phantoms in the physical space. To match the aggressive speed and power handling of this new tweeter, the API engineers paired it with a custom-built, highly linear woofer, a large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies such as bass and drums. These two drivers were bound together by a highly complex crossover, an electrical network inside a speaker that sends bass, mid-range, and treble to the drivers designed to handle them. The crossover network was meticulously tuned to match the flat frequency response proven by the NRC blind listening tests. When the Energy 22 finally hit Canadian hi-fi dealers, the reaction was immediate and profound. Audio showroom salesmen who were used to pushing speakers with exaggerated boomy bass or piercing, artificial treble suddenly had a product that simply sounded like the absolute truth. It did not try to flatter the music. It simply reproduced the signal. But the ultimate validation of the Energy 22 did not just come from retail consumers browsing stereo shops. It came from uncompromising audio professionals. Almost immediately, the Energy 22 was adopted as a primary studio monitor, a speaker used in recording studios to reveal details clearly during mixing. Canadian broadcast facilities and television control rooms began placing the Energy 22 directly on their mixing consoles. Recording engineers trusted the cabinet because the measurements did not lie. If a recording sounded harsh through the Energy 22, the recording was harsh. If it sounded brilliant, the recording was brilliant. The speaker had successfully crossed the perilous boundary between a domestic hi-fi product and a professional audio tool. For a Canadian buyer walking into a local music store in Toronto or Vancouver, the retail pitch was irresistible. You could buy the exact same acoustic lens that the broadcast engineer used to mix the nightly news. However, this breakthrough carried a hidden tension that would quietly shape the company's future over the next 2 decades. The manufacturing reality of the Dual Hyperdome tweeter was punishing. Building a world-class, laboratory-grade component by hand in Ontario was inherently expensive. It demanded highly skilled domestic labor, strict quality control, and a high rejection rate if a driver did not measure perfectly on the test bench. The Energy 22 proved that API could build one of the most accurate, scientifically validated loudspeakers on the planet. It gave the company an impregnable moat of engineering credibility and established the Energy brand as the premium, untouchable jewel in the API manufacturing crown. They had conquered the audiophile market and the broadcast studio in a single stroke, physically proving the Canadian measurement philosophy to the global audio world. But maintaining that level of uncompromising domestic manufacturing required an immense amount of capital, factory space, and retail volume. The sheer cost of perfection was looming. That first success did not solve the problem. It created a larger system that now had to be fed. The success of the Energy 22 did not just validate a scientific theory. It transformed Audio Products International from a successful domestic builder into a manufacturing leviathan. By the mid-1990s, the company's footprint in Scarborough, Ontario, had expanded into a staggering 165,000 square foot facility. This was not a modern, sterile logistics hub where workers merely unboxed and bolted together pre-assembled parts shipped in from overseas. It was a true, heavy industrial audio factory. The air on the shop floor smelled of vaporized flux, strong industrial adhesives, and raw MDF, medium-density fiberboard, a heavy, dense engineered wood used to build acoustically inert speaker cabinets that do not vibrate and color the sound. Hundreds of Canadian workers operated loud, heavy machinery. They pressed real wood veneers onto tall cabinets. They stood at winding machines, spinning fine copper wire to create heavy inductors for the crossovers. They operated the massive magnetizers that gave the raw drivers their motor strength. This was the absolute peak of the Canadian audio ecosystem, a moment when the science of the Ottawa lab and the muscle of the Ontario factory floor existed in perfect balance. But maintaining that balance was an expensive, high-stakes operation. This is where the sheer physical weight of domestic manufacturing became a permanent pressure. Every Energy speaker sold in a Calgary hi-fi shop or a Montreal stereo room carried the invisible burden of its creation. The retail price had to cover the cost of Canadian labor, the hydro bills to run the factory machinery, the specialized testing equipment at the end of the assembly line, and the vast warehouse space required to store thousands of finished wooden boxes. To justify this immense overhead and defend their reputation as a premium engineering house, Energy had to prove they were still pushing the boundaries of acoustic science. Their answer was the Energy Veritas line. Introduced in the 1990s, the Veritas series was the ultimate, uncompromising distillation of everything the NRC measurement culture had taught the company. The flagship model was a massive, imposing floor-standing speaker, a tall cabinet designed to rest directly on the floor, capable of moving enough air to reproduce the full scale of a symphony orchestra without needing external stands or a separate subwoofer. The Veritas did not use off-the-shelf parts. It featured a heavily braced, complex cabinet structure designed to eliminate internal resonances, But its true centerpiece was an exotic, custom-built mid-range dome driver, a specialized driver designed to reproduce the crucial middle frequencies where human voices, guitars, and pianos live. While most companies used simple paper cones for the mid-range, Energy engineered an aluminum dome that operated with pistonic precision. The manufacturing tolerances for the Veritas were punishing, but when it was placed in a dedicated Canadian listening room, the physical result was breathtaking. Because the dispersion of the tweeter and the mid-range dome matched perfectly, the Veritas achieved an almost magical acoustic disappearing act. When the listener closed their eyes, they could not pinpoint the physical location of the two wooden cabinets. The speaker projected a vast, holographic soundstage, the perceived width, depth, and placement of music created by a stereo system. The musicians seemed to occupy distinct physical space in the room, extending far beyond the left and right boundaries of the speakers themselves. Audio reviewers across North America and Europe were stunned. Energy was directly competing against boutique audiophile brands that charged 3 times the price and built a fraction of the volume. In the high-end hi-fi dealer rooms of Toronto and Vancouver, the Veritas proved that a massive corporate factory in Scarborough could still produce a delicate, laboratory-grade acoustic instrument. It anchored the brand's prestige, giving local stereo salesmen a flagship product they could use to completely dominate a listening demonstration. But prestige alone does not keep a 165,000 square foot factory running. The Veritas proved Energy's engineering supremacy, but the audio market was shifting rapidly beneath them. The era of the dedicated 2-channel stereo room was quietly giving way to a new, highly lucrative, and incredibly demanding obsession: surround sound home theater. To keep the massive Canadian machine fed, Energy was about to pivot toward this new market on a scale no one anticipated. In the mid to late 1990s, the Canadian audio market experienced a violent shift in listening habits. Buyers were no longer walking into stereo shops looking exclusively for a traditional 2-channel hi-fi setup to play records or CDs. They were walking into massive, brightly lit big-box retailers, clutching DVDs and demanding surround sound. The home theater era had arrived. Instead of 2 heavy wooden cabinets flanking a turntable, a typical Canadian basement rec room now required 5 individual speakers and a subwoofer, a speaker designed to reproduce very low bass frequencies to decode the explosive soundtracks of blockbuster films. All of this had to be powered by an AV processor, a home theater control unit that decodes surround formats and manages multiple channels. For a boutique audiophile brand, this sudden demand for 6 separate boxes was a logistical nightmare. But for a 165,000 square foot manufacturing plant in Scarborough, it was a massive opportunity. API possessed the sheer industrial muscle to build at this scale. Energy's answer to the surround sound boom was a product that would completely redefine the company's volume: the Energy Take 5. The Take 5 was a compact, integrated home theater system. It replaced the massive floor-standing towers of the previous decade with 5 small, highly efficient satellite speakers, relying entirely on the dedicated subwoofer to handle the low-end weight. But unlike the cheap, plastic surround sound in a box systems flooding the market from overseas, the Take 5 was fundamentally an Energy product. The tiny cabinets were still engineered using the strict NRC measurement principles. They still utilized sophisticated crossovers and custom-designed tweeters. When properly set up in a Calgary living room, the system did not just make noise. It created a seamless, 3-dimensional acoustic bubble. The commercial response was staggering. The Energy Take 5 became a dominant force on the audio walls of Future Shop, the massive Canadian electronics retail chain that was rapidly replacing the intimate, wood-paneled hi-fi dealer rooms of the 1980s. Inside the API factory in Scarborough, The scale of production reached an almost unimaginable fever pitch. The floor was a study in profound manufacturing contrast. On one side of the facility, skilled Canadian technicians were spending hours meticulously hand-assembling the aluminum mid-range domes and heavy internal bracing for the flagship Veritas towers. On the other side of the same building, massive automated assembly lines were churning out thousands of Take-5 satellite speakers, rushing to fulfill massive purchase orders from big-box retailers across North America. This is where the physical reality of domestic manufacturing became a dangerous tightrope. Building speakers on this scale in Ontario meant consuming staggering amounts of physical material. Pallets of MDF arrived daily. Miles of fine copper wire were wound into voice coils, thousands of heavy magnets, foam surrounds, the flexible ring around a woofer cone that lets it move in and out, and metal heat sinks for powered subwoofers had to be sourced, assembled, tested, packaged, and shipped. The API plant was a spectacular triumph of Canadian engineering and logistics, but it was also a trap. To keep a domestic factory of that immense size running, a company must maintain relentless, uninterrupted volume. The overhead costs, the hydro, the skilled Canadian labor, the property taxes, the warehousing, and the domestic supply chain were fixed and aggressively high. Every single speaker that rolled off the Scarborough line, from a premium Veritas cabinet to a budget Take-5 surround speaker, carried the invisible weight of that overhead. For a time, the sheer momentum of the home theater boom masked the underlying financial tension. Energy was widely considered one of the most successful speaker brands in North America. They had successfully translated the elite, measurement-driven philosophy of the NRC lab into a massive retail empire. They were winning awards, dominating magazine covers, and filling thousands of Canadian basement rec rooms with precisely engineered sound. They had mastered the physics of moving air, but they were about to collide with a force they could not measure in an anechoic chamber. The cost of domestic manufacturing was rising, just as the global retail market was preparing to aggressively drive prices down. The speakers worked flawlessly. The retail room around them was already beginning to change. The first quiet crack in the energy speaker empire did not happen in the Ottawa Acoustic Labs, and it did not happen on the assembly line in Scarborough. It happened on a retail spreadsheet. By the early 2000s, the Canadian audio landscape was undergoing a massive systemic change. The wood-paneled hi-fi dealer, a dedicated retail space where a knowledgeable salesman would spend an hour demonstrating a pair of premium Veritas towers to a seated listener, was being rapidly replaced by the big-box electronics warehouse. Brands like Future Shop and Best Buy were now dictating the terms of the audio industry. In these massive, brightly lit stores, a speaker, a device that turns an electrical audio signal into sound moving through air, was no longer treated as a precision acoustic instrument. It was sold alongside washing machines, microwaves, and televisions. This environment created a brutal new reality for Audio Products International. Big box retailers demanded aggressive, relentlessly low pricing. To win a spot in a weekend flyer, a home theater package had to hit an artificially low price point. Consumers were no longer comparing off-axis frequency response or distortion metrics. They were comparing the total price of a 5-speaker bundle. This created an impossible mathematical problem for a company committed to domestic production. Building a heavy speaker cabinet in Ontario meant paying for Canadian labor, local property taxes, industrial electricity, and raw materials like premium MDF and real wood veneers. As the big box chains aggressively squeezed profit margins, the massive 165,000 square foot facility in Scarborough slowly turned from an industrial asset into a massive financial liability. An energy speaker could still measure perfectly in the anechoic chamber. The specialized test room designed to absorb reflection so a speaker can be measured without the room interfering. It could still possess the most linear, uncolored sound on the market. But if it cost $50 more to build than a competitor's imported plastic-heavy box, it lost the shelf space. The NRC measurement culture, which had given Energy its impregnable reputation in the 1980s, could not protect the brand from the ruthless economics of warehouse retail. The tension finally broke in August 2006. The industry was shocked when Klipsch Group, a massive American audio corporation, announced it had acquired API. On paper, corporate press releases framed the buyout as a powerful global synergy. Energy, Mirage, and Athena, API's three core Canadian brands, would join forces with the American giant to create an unstoppable audio portfolio. But the physical reality on the ground in Ontario was fundamentally different. Klipsch was a company famous for the horn speaker, a speaker that uses a flared passage to make a driver more efficient and project sound into a room. Their engineering philosophy prioritized high sensitivity and dynamic output, which was a stark contrast to the flat, neutral, laboratory-driven ethos of the Canadian NRC researchers. More importantly, a global parent company does not need duplicate factories, duplicate acoustic labs, or duplicate engineering teams. The American parent already possessed an established, highly efficient global supply chain heavily reliant on offshore manufacturing partners in Asia. The massive API facility in Scarborough, once the beating heart of the Canadian measurement culture, was suddenly redundant. The assembly lines did not shut down overnight, but the retreat was undeniable and systematic. The production of intricate, hand-assembled components like the specialized mid-range drivers and the heavy, internally braced cabinets was gradually shifted overseas. The skilled Canadian technicians who had spent decades meticulously winding copper voice coils, stitching tweeter suspensions, and soldering complex crossovers, the electrical networks inside a speaker that send bass, mid-range, and treble to the correct drivers, found themselves standing in a factory that was slowly going quiet. The physical transition was heartbreaking for the Canadian audio community. A local hi-fi dealer in Montreal or Vancouver could no longer point to an Energy speaker and confidently tell a buyer that it was built just a few hours down the highway. The engineering decisions were no longer being driven primarily by the pursuit of absolute acoustic truth in a Canadian test lab. They were being driven by the need to fit the Energy brand into specific, predetermined price brackets within a larger corporate portfolio. Energy was being transformed from a proud, independent engineering house into a strategic label. The brand was being positioned to capture the mid-tier home theater market, while the parent company's primary badge occupied the premium spotlight. The badge still remained on the front of the grill cloth. The Canadian engineering promise it originally stood for was quietly starting to move offshore. The corporate consolidation of 2006 had moved the manufacturing offshore, but an even more profound disruption was about to rewrite the rules of the living room. By the early 2010s, the golden era of the multi-cabinet home theater was collapsing. Canadian consumers, who had enthusiastically wired 5 separate satellite speakers and a heavy subwoofer across their basement rec rooms a decade earlier, were suddenly demanding extreme minimalism. They no longer wanted cables running under their rugs. They no longer wanted an AV processor, a home theater control unit that decodes surround formats and manages multiple channels, taking up space in an equipment rack. They wanted a soundbar. A soundbar, a long, powered, all-in-one speaker cabinet designed to sit directly under a flat-screen television and replace an entire surround sound system, was an existential threat to traditional speaker manufacturers. Building a high-quality, heavy wooden cabinet was no longer the primary objective. The new market demanded wireless connectivity, internal digital amplification, and software integration. For a brand built entirely on the science of acoustic volume, cabinet bracing, and meticulous crossover design, this technological shift was devastating. An energy speaker was designed to physically move air in a room. A soundbar was designed to physically disappear under a screen. This shift in how the market listened coincided with a final, massive corporate absorption. In 2011, Klipsch Group itself was acquired by AudioVox, a global electronics conglomerate that would later be known as Vox International. Energy Speakers was no longer an independent Canadian engineering house, nor was it even the primary focus of an American audio company. It was now a sub-brand buried within the portfolio of a massive, multinational umbrella corporation that produced everything from car alarms to remote controls. The distance between the NRC anechoic chamber in Ottawa and the corporate boardroom had become infinite. In this new global ecosystem, the Energy brand was fundamentally repositioned. The name still carried weight with North American consumers. Buyers remembered the pristine sound of the Veritas towers in high-end stereo shops, or the punchy reliability of the Take 5 system they had bought at Future Shop. The new parent company understood the value of that memory, but they did not need a 165,000 square foot factory in Scarborough to deliver it. They only needed the trademark. The physical products bearing the Energy logo began to change dramatically. The heavy, acoustically inert MDF cabinets, medium-density fiberboard, a heavy, dense engineered wood used to build speaker cabinets that do not vibrate and color the sound, were replaced by lightweight, injection-molded plastics. The intricate, hand-stitched Dual Hyperdome tweeters that had defined the brand's breakthrough were entirely gone, replaced by inexpensive, mass-produced, off-the-shelf drivers that could be sourced cheaply from global supply chains. Energy became a label slapped onto generic, entry-level soundbars, cheap wireless subwoofers, and basic Bluetooth speakers, small, portable, battery-powered devices that receive audio wirelessly from a smartphone. This was the ultimate consequence of brand dilution. The product on the big box retail shelf no longer shared any physical or philosophical DNA with the Canadian engineers who had originally drawn its blueprints. If a buyer looked at the measurements of these new, generic products, they would not find the perfectly flat frequency response or the carefully controlled off-axis dispersion that Dr. Floyd Toole had proven was necessary for accurate playback. They would find the exact kind of artificially boosted, uneven sound that the API engineers had spent 3 decades trying to eradicate. The system had not just weakened, it had inverted. The Canadian factory slowed. The domestic assembly lines were dismantled. The heavy winding machines were turned off. The local supply chain of wood, glue, and copper collapsed. The engineering teams scattered to other industries. The pursuit of acoustic truth was replaced by the pursuit of retail margins. The physical footprint in Scarborough was silenced. A Canadian buyer walking into a warehouse store could still pick up a cardboard box with the Energy logo printed on the side. The badge still meant Canadian engineering to the buyer. The ownership behind it had completely moved on. Today, the Energy brand has not technically vanished from the market. The trademark survived the successive waves of corporate acquisitions and remains an active intellectual property within the massive Vox International portfolio. But survival in the modern global audio industry often demands a complete transformation of identity. The logo that once represented uncompromising, laboratory-tested Canadian engineering is now commonly found stamped on mass-market soundbars, inexpensive wireless subwoofers, and portable Bluetooth speakers. The name continues to exist on the shelves, but the acoustic philosophy that originally birthed it, the relentless pursuit of a perfectly flat frequency response measured inside an Ottawa anechoic chamber, has been completely severed from the physical product. Yet, the original physical objects built during the height of the Audio Products International era absolutely refused to disappear. Across Canada, a vibrant, obsessive community of vintage audio enthusiasts, collectors, and repair technicians actively hunts for surviving API cabinets. On Canuck Audio Mart and in local Kijiji listings from Halifax to Vancouver, the original Energy 22 and the towering, heavily braced Veritas models are not treated as obsolete technology. They are fiercely protected. They are revered as precision acoustic instruments that still routinely outperform modern, mass-produced speakers, costing thousands of dollars more. This survival goes far beyond simple nostalgia. The legacy of Energy is physically proven every day on the modern Canadian repair bench. The famous Dual Hyperdome tweeter, a small driver designed to reproduce high frequencies, such as cymbals, strings, and vocal detail, was a mechanical masterpiece, but it was not immortal. Over 4 decades of use, the specialized ferrofluid cooling liquid inside the heavy magnet structure would inevitably dry out, and the hand-stitched suspensions could stiffen or shift. Today, dedicated Canadian technicians perform absolute acoustic surgery to save them. They carefully heat and slice the 40-year-old adhesives. They meticulously clean the microscopic magnetic gap with specialized paper. They inject fresh fluid and realign the delicate domes entirely by hand. They do this painstaking work because the physical engineering is still inherently valuable. When properly restored, an Energy 22 does not just sound like a warm memory. It projects a stereo image, the illusion that sounds come from places between and around 2 speakers, that remains startlingly realistic and ruthlessly accurate. It proves that the NRC measurement culture was fundamentally correct. A speaker built to absolute scientific truth in 1982 does not age out of being truthful today. The physical scale of that truth, however, is a different story. The massive 165,000 square foot facility in Scarborough, Ontario, no longer smells of vaporized solder, heavy industrial adhesives, and freshly cut MDF, medium-density fiberboard, a heavy, dense engineered wood used to build speaker cabinets that do not vibrate and color the sound. The heavy winding machines are gone. The complex dual assembly lines that once churned out both delicate Veritas domes and thousands of Take-5 home theater systems have long been dismantled. The local supply chain of raw wood, copper, and Canadian labor that fed the API empire collapsed. The building itself became just another piece of repurposed industrial real estate in the Greater Toronto Area, a quiet, sprawling monument to a time when Canada did not just design premium audio, but possessed the sheer industrial muscle to manufacture it at a global scale. There is, however, a quiet footnote to the API collapse. When the Scarborough facility was finally silenced and the engineering team scattered, that Canadian talent did not simply leave the audio industry. The acoustic knowledge forged in the energy design rooms dispersed across North America. Former API engineers, acoustic researchers, and cabinet designers went on to influence other major audio brands. They carried the strict, measurement-driven philosophy of the NRC lab into new companies, ensuring that the rigorous Canadian approach to sound reproduction survived in the broader market, even if the original factory did not. The story of Energy speakers is the story of a brilliant acoustic triumph colliding with an unstoppable economic reality. It proved that strict science could conquer the subjective listening room. It proved that a domestic factory could build a world-class instrument that broadcast studios implicitly trusted. But it also proved that the modern audio market does not always reward perfection. A perfectly flat frequency response measured in $1 million anechoic chamber ultimately had to compete against a cheap plastic box placed next to a washing machine in a weekend flyer. When the retail environment shifted from the dedicated, knowledgeable hi-fi dealer to the big box warehouse, and when consumer listening habits shifted from the heavy stereo pair to the convenient wireless soundbar, the sheer cost of Canadian manufacturing became an impossible burden. Energy solved the complex physics of moving air, but it was ultimately outmaneuvered by the ruthless physics of retail. Somewhere in an Ontario basement, an original pair of heavy wood veneer Energy 22s sits perfectly positioned on their heavy steel stands, a restored Dual Hyperdome tweeter catching the light. waiting for one more record to prove the lab was right. See you in the next one.